I'm Anne Woolfield.
I'm Carla Pecoraro.
And I'm Mel Akerman, and we're your hosts of the Uterine Sound podcast, bringing you up-to-date information in all things O&G. Today we'll cover preterm labour.
Now this is a big topic, so we don't want to bore you with hour-long podcasts. We've decided to cover this topic over a few episodes. Today we'll cover the background, etiology and risk factors for preterm birth. This is all the important background stuff, but it can definitely get dry. So if you want to skip to the workup of someone presenting with threatened preterm labour, skip to the next episode. All right, Mel, so what exactly is preterm birth?
Preterm birth is defined as delivery between 20 and 36 plus 6 weeks of gestation. We don't include babies born before 20 weeks, as these are generally referred to as a miscarriage or a second trimester pregnancy loss. And babies born after 37 weeks are generally considered early term if born before 39 weeks and term if born after 39 weeks. Preterm birth can be subdivided into late preterm, moderate preterm, very preterm, and extremely preterm. Extremely preterm baby, I know. An extremely preterm baby is one who is born before 28 weeks gestation. A very preterm baby is born between 28 and 31 plus 6 weeks. A moderately preterm baby is born between 32 and 33 plus 6 weeks, and a late preterm baby is born between 34 to 36 plus 6 weeks. By far, moderate and late preterm births account for the majority of preterm deliveries, with a rate of about 6.5%. Very preterm and extremely preterm births are much less common, occurring in less than 1% of pregnancies each.
And Australia's current preterm birth rate is about 8.1% of pregnancies, although this is much higher in our First Nations population at around 14.2%. That's quite a lot. If preterm birth happens so frequently, why do we care so much about it?
Preterm birth is such a big deal. It's probably one of the main focuses around the world. WHO Australia focuses for improving maternal and neonatal health because it's the leading cause of neonatal morbidity and mortality around the world. It's also the single greatest cause of death and disability in children up to 5 years of age. Just to demonstrate the magnitude of this issue, let me throw some stats at you. I love stats. So worldwide, about 13 million babies are born preterm every year. Because of complications of preterm birth, about 1 million children die each year because of preterm birth. And of those that survive, many have learning disabilities and sensory problems, which not only have such a big impact on that child and their family, but also has really significant costs and implications to healthcare services and society in general. Preterm birth is associated with perinatal mortality, long-term neurological disability like cerebral palsy, admission to the NICU, severe morbidity in the first weeks of life, prolonged hospital stay after birth, readmission to hospital in the first year of life, and an increased risk of chronic lung disease. In Australia alone, more than 26,000 babies are born preterm each year, which works out to be about 1 in 11.
Wow. So now you've definitely got me interested. Preterm birth, otherwise known as birth after 20 weeks and before 37 weeks, occurs in 8.1% of pregnancies in Australia. It's divided into extremely preterm, very preterm, moderately preterm, and late preterm, and it's a huge cause of neonatal morbidity and mortality worldwide. Why does it happen?
Well, most preterm deliveries occur spontaneously as a result of either preterm labour or preterm rupture of membranes. You might remember from our previous episode that PPROM is related to 30 to 40% of preterm births. Less commonly, preterm birth might result from intervention for fetal or maternal problems, for example, preeclampsia, fetal growth restriction, placenta previa, or placental abruption. Now, in general, there are 4 pathogenic pathways which activate one final common pathway leading to the onset of labour. These 4 pathways include hormonal changes, infection or inflammation, decidual hemorrhage, and pathologic uterine distension. Hormonal changes refer to premature activation of the fetal hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis in response to maternal or fetal stressors. Infection, whether ascending, transplacental, or through the fallopian tubes, elicits an inflammatory response. Decidual hemorrhage due to abruption or smaller bleeds leads to the generation of thrombin. And pathological uterine distension, for example, in the case of polyhydramnios, multiple pregnancy, or uterine abnormalities, causes stretching of the myometrium. Now, all 4 pathways lead to one common pathway, which is the activation of inflammatory mechanisms, release of cytokines and prostaglandins, which triggers the onset of labour.
Are there any other pathways that lead to preterm labour?
Another really important one is cervical insufficiency. Cervical insufficiency refers to the pathologic dilatation or effacement of the cervix in absence of uterine contractions that leads to pre-viable pregnancy loss and spontaneous preterm birth. I guess you usually hear about it as asymptomatic cervical dilatation in the mid-trimester. Structural cervical weakness may be due to previous cervical or uterine surgery, or very rarely a congenital anomaly. Things like agenesis of the cervix. Cervical insufficiency may also be related to the 4 pathways Mel mentioned: infection, bleeding, uterine overdistension, and hormonal changes, which can initiate the biochemical changes within the cervix that leads to the premature cervical shortening and extreme prematurity and pregnancy loss.
And preterm birth can also have a genetic basis. So pregnant women who were themselves born preterm have a higher risk of preterm birth. And if your sister had a preterm birth, your risk of preterm birth is also increased. There are also significant ethnic differences in the risk of spontaneous preterm birth. As we said before, our First Nations birth rate is 14.2%, so nearly double what the standard rate is, I know. And all of these factors together suggest that genetic factors might be involved, and there have been quite a few genetic loci that have been shown to be associated with preterm birth. Although I don't think we're quite at the point of being able to screen people for their genetic predisposition to preterm birth yet.
So to summarise then, the main mechanisms involved in preterm birth are hormonal changes, infection, decidual hemorrhage and uterine distension, all of which lead to a common final pathway of release of inflammatory cytokines and prostaglandins, and then labour. And other pathogenic pathways include cervical insufficiency and genetic predisposition. Can you tell me about some of the risk factors for preterm birth? Like, who should we be keeping our spidey senses out for?
There are so many factors that have been associated with an increased risk of spontaneous preterm birth, but it's important to note that the majority of women with traditional risk factors will not experience preterm birth. And of those women who do experience preterm birth, many have no risk factors. I like to divide risk factors into maternal and pregnancy-related risk factors. Maternal ones include demographic things like age, less than 18 or over 35, low or high BMI, ethnicity including African, Southeast Asian and our First Nations Australian, low socioeconomic status and living in rural remote communities. Other things like smoking, recreational drugs, limited antenatal care, psychological stress, uterine anomalies and previous uterine or cervical surgery.
And the pregnancy-related risk factors include things that relate to the pathogenic pathways. So you've got your previous preterm birth, second trimester loss or PPROM, both in the current or previous pregnancy. Then there's uterine distension in the case of multiple pregnancy or polyhydramnios. Bleeding, threatened miscarriage and antepartum hemorrhage also increase the risk. And infections. Then there are a few other things like having a short cervix under 25 millimeters or a positive fetal fibronectin, having an IVF pregnancy, a short interpregnancy interval under 12 months, and certain medical conditions.
So let's go into a bit more depth with these risk factors, because people who have a preterm birth are always interested in finding out more about their own risk factors. Let's start with previous preterm birth.
So, history of spontaneous preterm birth is a major risk factor for recurrence. We typically quote a recurrence rate of about 15 to 20%. The magnitude of the risk depends on a number of things. First, the cause for your previous preterm birth, the gestational age of your previous preterm birth, and the number of previous preterm births you've had. So, the earlier you've had a baby, the higher the chance that you are to have another preterm birth in the future. So, say, for example, you had a baby at 28 weeks, because it's very early preterm birth, you're much more highly likely than, say, if you were at 36 weeks. The more babies that you have, so if you had 3+ babies born preterm, you're highly likely to have another preterm baby. Interestingly, recurrent preterm births tend to occur at a similar gestational age. So again, if you had your 28-weeker, you're much more likely to have another baby at that 28 weeks. Something that I thought was interesting is that in women who've had a history of prior indicated preterm birth, for example, if you delivered at 26 weeks with severe preeclampsia, that woman is at risk of recurrent indicated preterm obviously because the risk of preeclampsia recurs, but also indicated preterm birth is another risk factor for spontaneous preterm birth.
Oh, it's such bad luck. I just feel so sorry for the ones that get the preterm birth. And then you have to tell them that in future pregnancies they've got more risk, just on and on. But it is interesting. I guess another thing is like the risk of preterm birth with previous cervical surgery. Whenever I book a woman for a LETS procedure, I'm always counselling on the risk of preterm birth. What exactly is that risk?
Well, there have been quite a few studies that have looked at the association of LETS with preterm birth, and after reading quite a few of them, here is what I can summarise for you. So we know that LETS is associated with an increased risk of preterm birth. However, it's also important to note that women with cervical dysplasia who decline a LETS are also at a higher risk of preterm birth than women without cervical dysplasia.
Yeah.
So there's something to do with the pathology of the cervical dysplasia itself that increases the risk of preterm birth. And we know that the risk of preterm birth increases with the number of LETS procedures, as well as the depth of the excisional specimen. For example, if a woman has had 2 LETS procedures, she has 4 times the risk of preterm delivery in comparison to a woman with no LETS, and double the risk of preterm birth than women with 1 previous LETS. Now, a cone biopsy or a deep LETS also further increases your risk of preterm birth, and these women should really be offered serial cervical length screening, which is something we'll go into more detail on in our next episode.
And what about D&Cs? Do they increase the risk of preterm birth?
So suction D&Cs for miscarriage or surgical termination of pregnancy do appear to have a small but statistically significant impact in the risk of preterm birth in subsequent pregnancies. We're talking about 5.7 versus 5%. And it appears to be independent of complications of D&Cs like uterine perforation, cervical tears, or Ashman syndrome. So the more D&Cs a person has, the higher the risk of preterm birth. This information is important and should definitely be mentioned to women who are trying to decide between medical and surgical termination or medical or surgical management of first trimester pregnancy losses. Although, note that the majority of data comes from observational studies, so the quality of the evidence is lower. Interestingly, hysteroscopies do not appear to impact the risk of preterm birth.
And then what about cervical polyps or fibroids?
So the presence of cervical polyps in pregnancy is associated with an increased risk of preterm birth, but unfortunately, according to a recent meta-analysis released this year in April, removing the cervical polyp in pregnancy has an even higher risk of preterm birth. So it's thought that it might be safer to not remove cervical polyps during pregnancy, except in cases where the polyp is symptomatic or suspected to be malignant. And we know that fibroids also increase the risk of preterm birth, particularly when the fibroids are large, and by large I mean generally over 5 centimetres, particularly if they're submucosal and also multiple fibroids. And there's also an impact when the placenta implants over or adjacent to the fibroid, and those things seem to increase the risk of preterm labour as well.
And then what about infections? Like which infections increase the risk of preterm birth?
So preterm birth is associated with a number of different infections, the main ones being bacterial vaginosis, periodontal disease, and asymptomatic bacteria. So naturally you'd think that screening and treating these would reduce the risk of preterm birth. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Treatment of BV, periodontal disease, and asymptomatic bacteria has not been shown to reduce the risk of preterm birth. Many people think that we treat asymptomatic bacteria to reduce the risk of preterm birth. In actual fact, asymptomatic bacteria is associated with pyelonephritis and low birth weight, but it doesn't seem to be an independent risk factor for preterm birth. And while treating asymptomatic bacteria reduces pyelonephritis and reduces low birth weight, it doesn't reduce the risk of preterm birth. Periodontal disease is another common infection, which is cited as having an association with preterm birth. However, causation has not been proven, and treating periodontal disease in pregnant patients does not reduce the risk of preterm birth. An alternative theory is that periodontal disease occurs in individuals who are predisposed towards an exaggerated inflammatory response, and that these people are more likely to have an exaggerated inflammatory response to vaginal bacteria, which might be contributing to preterm birth. Chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, and malaria are all examples of infections that have been associated with preterm birth. In these infections, treatment has been shown to reduce the risk of preterm birth. In theory, any systemic infection could trigger inflammatory pathways, resulting in an increased risk. So whether a patient's been admitted with pyelonephritis, influenza, or another systemic illness, we're always alert to the possibility of preterm labour. And just a little fun fact, thrush, not a risk factor for preterm birth. Although there are some studies looking at whether treatment of asymptomatic candidiasis reduces the risk. So stay tuned. I'm sure you're all aware by now, the evidence is always changing.
I can't wait for that. Obviously, also multiple pregnancy increases the risk of preterm birth.
Yeah, that's right. So about half of all twins deliver before 36 weeks and half of all triplets deliver before 32 weeks. So many mothers of twins and triplets go into premature labour spontaneously, but others might need to have premature labour induced because of complications during their pregnancy. Now, some of this spontaneous preterm labour has got to do with uterine distension, but also the endocrine environment produced by superovulation may also play a role. So superovulation can result in higher circulating levels of the hormone relaxin, which may promote cervical insufficiency with subsequent preterm birth. And we know that twins and triplets also produce higher amounts of estrogen, progesterone, and sex steroids compared with singleton gestations. And this increase in steroids is also thought to be a factor in the initiation of labour.
I've also heard of a few random risk factors, like baby boys are more likely to be born preterm than baby girls, and short women are more likely to have preterm babies than tall women. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. They're on my list of risk factors for my exam study.
Yes, it is right.
Fun.
There's also a few other interesting things that don't seem to increase the risk of preterm birth. For example, sex and exercise do not increase the risk of preterm birth, and paternal genes don't matter at all. Crazy. So even if the dad was born preterm or had a previous partner whose baby was born preterm or had family members, none of it seems to increase the risk of preterm birth.
Poor dads, left out of the loop again. Oh, and I have a random fact. So we know that BMI obviously increases the risk of preterm birth, mainly due to coexisting medical conditions that increase the risk of iatrogenic preterm birth. But also a low BMI increases the risk. And they know this because in sheep, if you have a malnourished sheep mum around the time that she conceives, the fetal hypothalamic pituitary axis matures early, which results in a fetal cortisol surge and a premature baby sheep. And in Gambia, women who fall pregnant during the rainy season when there's not much food around have significantly shorter pregnancies than those conceived when food is more plentiful. And I think this was also shown in the Dutch famine as well. So interesting. Keep up your nourishment, ladies.
Wow, of course Mel knows these things. I guess we've listed quite a lot of risk factors for preterm birth. Surely there must be some kind of algorithm or biomarker that allows us to predict who will and who won't go into preterm labour.
Well, there are a few scoring systems which add up scores for certain risk factors to tell you whether a patient's at high or low risk of preterm birth. But unfortunately, the positive predictive value of most of these scoring systems is quite low, sitting at around 20 to 30%. And so systematic reviews have concluded that there's currently no effective risk scoring system that we can use to predict preterm birth. It also doesn't help that the biggest risk factor for preterm birth is previous preterm birth, which is not very helpful if this is your first pregnancy. And fetal fibronectin, which we all know we use for detection of threatened preterm labour, which we'll talk about in our next episode. Stay tuned. So fetal fibronectin is collected by a vaginal swab. It's also been used as a screening test for predicting risk of preterm birth in both high-risk and asymptomatic nulliparous people. But again, it's got a pretty low positive predictive value, and it's not currently recommended for asymptomatic women. Now, this is something that I've only just learned. There is a serum screening test called Preterm, Preterm, which tests for two serum proteins, insulin-like growth factor binding protein 4 and sex hormone binding globulin. But although this is available, there's lots of data saying the test needs to be adequately tested and validated before routine use, which is obviously not what the manufacturers on the website will say, but not quite validated yet.
Convenient.
Yeah. And there are about 30 other biomarkers that have been studied for determining which pregnant are at risk of preterm birth, but unfortunately none of them have been shown to be very useful clinically. So watch this space. Keep going, researchers.
Damn, yeah. I guess that wraps up our background to preterm birth. Join us next week for a rundown on the workup and management of preterm labour.
Thanks for listening to the Uterine Sound. If you've got any feedback, questions, or topics you'd love to hear in the future episode, please email us at theuterinesound@gmail.com or message us on Instagram. We'd love to hear from you.
Tell Mel if you like her sheep facts.
And don't be scared to fact check us. Sometimes we are wrong,
Yeah.
believe it or not.
Yeah.
We'll never admit it, but no, we will in the next episode.